Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Helix Center and our conference on coding and the new human phenotype. This is the fifth of 4 roundtables. The previous 4 have been, I think, fantastic, and I welcome our audience out there to check out those 4 roundtables that are available on YouTube. This afternoon, we are excited about our topic, which is the universe. Is the universe a metaverse? And we're going to hear more about that and what that could possibly mean, because maybe the title is a bit opaque, perhaps not. But I want to tell you something about our participants before we proceed. Elias Dakwar, Dr. Elias Dakwar actually helped conceive some of this idea of the entire conference on coding. I want to thank him for that. He's taking part today as one of the participants. He's an associate professor at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons and a board-certified addiction and general psychiatrist. He has been researching novel treatments for addiction for over a decade and the support of several grants from the National Institutes of Health. A special focus of his research has been evaluating sub-anesthetic ketamine infusions for cocaine use disorders in both laboratory and clinical settings, as well as investigating ketamine infusions as an adjunct to mindfulness-based treatment, mind-body practices, motivational interviewing, and other behavioral frameworks for alcohol, cannabis, and opiate use disorders. He has a more general interest in the impact of contemplative and non-ordinary experiences and of the interventions that might occasion them in the cultivation of well-being. Christopher Fuchs is a professor of physics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, who specializes in quantum information theory and quantum foundations. He is an author or co-author of over 160 scholarly pieces, one of which, Unconditional Quantum Teleportation with H.J. Kimball's experimental group, was voted a, quote, top 10 breakthrough of 1998, unquote, by the editors of Science. He is a winner of the International Quantum Communication Award and a fellow of the American Physical Society. He is most widely known for the development of the quantum interpretation known as cubism, where quantum theory is not seen as a direct representation of what is in the universe, but rather as an aid to decision-making in a universe where nature's events have a kind of ultimate autonomy or creativity. Emily Adlam is a postdoctorate associate at the Rotman Institute for Philosophy of Science at the University of Western Ontario. She received her PhD in relativistic quantum information from the University of Cambridge. Prior to that, she completed the Perimeter Scholars International Program in theoretical physics, and she did her undergraduate degree in physics and philosophy at the University of Oxford. She works on the foundations of quantum mechanics and related issues in the philosophy of science, and is particularly interested in approaches to physics which go beyond the time evolution paradigm, encompassing a range of possibilities like temporal non-locality, retrocausality, and all-at-once laws. Sylvester James Jim Gates Jr. is a theoretical physicist. He is a University of Maryland University Systems Regents Professor, the John S. Professor of Physics, and a College Park Professor Emeritus. He currently holds the Clark Leadership Chair in Science and serves as a Professor of Physics with the Physics Department, as well as Affiliate Professor of Public Policy in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, College Park, Maryland. Gates served on the U.S. President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, contemporaneously on the Maryland State Board of Education from 2009 to 2016, and the National Commission on Forensic Science from 2013 to 2016. He is known for his work on supersymmetry, supergravity, and superstring theory. David Chalmers is University Professor of Philosophy and Neuroscience and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at New York University. He is author of The Conscious Mind, Constructing the World, and Reality, Virtual Worlds, and the Problems of Philosophy, which was just released this year. He co-founded the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness and Phil Papers Foundation. He has given the John Locke Lecture and has been awarded the Jean Nicode Prize. He is known for formulating the quote-unquote hard problem of consciousness, which inspired Tom Stocker's play, The Hard Problem, and for the idea of the extended mind, which says that the tools we use can become parts of our minds. 1 minute. Oh, let me take this, sorry. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Okay, everyone, welcome. This is really a very exciting topic for us to leap into, and I hope we will make a leap. So does anyone want to start off with a general sort of formulation of what it might mean for the universe to be a metaverse?
Well, I'm willing to start. First of all, I would say it doesn't mean what most people think, at least from my perspective. What my own research has led me to do in this area is quite astounding. I started from a position of total skepticism, having read about John Wheeler's It from Bit, which is, that information leads to the existence of that universe that we live in. And I remember when I was young, first reading it, thinking, what an insane idea. So 15 or 20 years ago, in my own research, I found mathematical evidence of error-correcting codes in what may be the fundamental laws of our universe if ideas related to string theory are correct. And so at that point, I concluded that if you think about this stuff long enough, you too can actually become crazy.
Well, embedded in that idea is this notion that the information is sort of an elemental aspect of the universe. Is that true? Is that a good way to put it?
I don't know. So I'm a disciple of John Wheeler's that you just mentioned. I did some undergraduate work with him. And his thinking went through various stages. He started, I think when it was finally realized that black holes were inevitable, Wheeler started worrying that somehow every law of physics could ultimately be transcended. So for instance, it used to be believed that baryon number was a fixed quantity in the universe, which you throw the baryons into the black hole, and the number of baryons decreases. So what was once considered the law of physics was transcended by black holes. And so he went through this phase of thinking, well, this is transcended, that is transcended. And he was left with a position where he would say, there is laws, but the only law is that there is no law, because they're always ultimately transcended. So law without law was one of his slogans. And after that, he started thinking, well, if the universe isn't made of particles or fields or even geometry, because geometry can become singular, what must it be made of? And that's where he somehow landed on the idea that it was information. And so I took that as my starting point. But then ultimately I sort of worked away from that because it ontologized information in a way that I thought was unhealthy thinking. So what we needed to understand instead was that the universe is the universe, and then there are thinking beings in this universe, and they use information. And they use information in certain ways because the universe is a certain way. But the information itself is not part of the stuff of the universe. So one can transcend one's mentor.
Yeah, I also tend to be quite skeptical about the it from bit hypothesis because I think it fails to distinguish between what is in the world and the information that we receive about the world. Obviously, we formulate physics on the basis of information that we have received, and thus, it's quite natural that the physics we thus formulate exhibits various information theoretic properties because it's the result of certain sort of epistemic constraints that agents like us are subject to. Our physics is going to reflect those kinds of constraints. It's going to reflect the kinds of information information we can obtain. But that doesn't mean that the physics is about information. It just means the physics is formulated on the basis of information, and thus it will naturally have information theoretic features.
I mean, our topic is the universe a metaverse? I think the metaverse actually has features that go beyond the simple it from bit idea. It may have something in common. I mean, the metaverse standardly stands for a virtual world that we create. I mean, Neil Stephenson introduced the term in his science fiction novel Snow Crash back in 1992, where the metaverse was basically a virtual reality environment that people would go into with headsets and the like, and interact with other people and live at least a partly digital life. And now, of course, the tech corporations have appropriated this idea and are using it. Meta is now using it as a label for the ecosystem of virtual worlds that they would like to build. So when I hear, is the universe a metaverse? I hear, is our universe a virtual world inside someone else's universe, in the same way that the metaverse would be a digital world, a virtual world inside our universe. I mean, that would have elements of the it from bit idea in it, because if our universe is a virtual world inside someone else's metaverse, then presumably we're running on someone else's computers, and there's going to be a level of bits there. But I take it, but that idea, though, that we're in a virtual world, goes way beyond the it from bit. The it from bit idea. The it from bit idea can be understood as saying there's a level of digital processes in the constitution of our worlds. Maybe there's even a digital physics. It's an interesting speculation, maybe true, maybe false. But is the universe a metaverse? It's like it from bit on steroids. There's bits and there's bits, and we are grounded within a vast universe beyond it.
Well, how could it have been very appealing, let's say, to Wheeler? And there's also, I think, Ed Fredkin also had written about this some years back. So since we have mostly skeptics here, it seems, about that idea of it from bit, that's great. That seems like nice to have that sort of consensus. But
I like the idea.
No, I think it looked like it was 2 and 2.
Okay.
So Emily and me and Ben.
All right. Well, I'm interested in us sort of fleshing out just to be fair and honest to the idea. What is it? Because I think the general audience may not appreciate, well, what does that even mean to say the universe is made up of information? That seems, like if you say it's made up of atoms, you go, all right, I got that, it's a little ball.
Well, there's quite a distinction. So you brought up Ed Fredkin. Ed Fredkin thought that the world was a program running on something that the last time I heard him speak was the other. The universe is a program running on the other. What's the other, Ed? Well, no answer. And so that I never found a productive line of thought. Wheeler, on the other hand, didn't think that the universe was a program running on anything. So when he was saying it from bit, he would even say that the only thing that's going on in the universe is higgledy-piggledy, which was the first time I'd ever heard the term, and I had to look it up in Oxford English Dictionary.
Right.
That the universe is just sort of bubbling out of chaos. But the stuff that's bubbling up is information in Wheeler's mind. So they're very different worldviews. So
But remember, there's no ether, right? I mean, for a long time it seemed we couldn't do any physics without there being an ether.
Yeah.
Right? And people said, oh, no, there isn't. But we still have these waves, right? I mean, so is it fair to be too critical of him for not being able to come up with, well, what is, I kind of...
Oh, you mean Fredkin?
Yeah.
Is it fair to be critical for somebody who says...
I can't tell you what the medium is.
I can't tell you what the universe is, but it's running on the other.
The idea, on the other hand,
you might say the mind of God, and how is this more productive? that would be my one.
The idea goes way beyond Fredkin, though. I mean, Konrad Zuse, who one of the inventors of the computer back in 1943, he wrote reams manuscripts on the idea that physics might be digital, and that's what I take to be the core idea of it from bit. Just that there's a level of physics which is somehow digital. If, for example, as Stephen Wolfram has sometimes thought, maybe our universe is a cellular automaton running off, like the game of life. Bits interacting with bits at the bottom level. That would be digital physics. That would be enough. It's probably true, but it's not a crazy idea. It's a perfectly sensible idea that physics could be digital.
Can I even push it back one step further? So, as I said, when I, in my own work, found evidence for error-correcting codes, possibly in the standard sorts of laws that follow from Einstein and Maxwell, which is where we physicists make our living, I had a hard time getting it published, that we were finding error-correcting codes in this thing called supersymmetry, which is an extension. We've not seen it in the laboratory, but it extends mathematically the tradition that starts with Maxwell and Einstein. And so when I wrestled with this, one of the things that occurred to me is that it's not just about the digital part, because you can in my mind, you can go all the way back to Plato's allegory of the cave and ask the questions, where do we fit in that story? Because I'm sure you're all familiar, this is a famous parable about these individuals trapped in a cage that can only see shadows on a wall, and they perceive those shadows, and the shadows come from outside the cave, and they perceive those shadows as being reality. But when exposed to actual reality, they don't know how to interpret readily what they're encountering. And in some sense, to me, it's really odd that this several millennia-year-old idea has been partially realized, and where physics has taken us a couple of thousand years later. To me, this is a very odd development. But one of the things I would caution a group like this discussing these ideas is not to forget what Einstein said about Galileo. Einstein called Galileo the father of physics because, and this is Einstein's word, he drummed it into our heads that the way we know about reality is by measuring and observing reality. And that if you have a proposition that leads to no measurable outcome, it exceeds the definition of science.
Well, it's sort of like this idea that that's a metaphysics. You're dabbling in metaphysics. But it's interesting that you mention these error-correcting codes, and I think, well, if a consequence of your view of the universe or your model of the universe includes error-correcting codes that you're citing, we say, well, that's a consequence, right? So could you say more about that? I mean, is there a way to test that, or are there implications of that idea that might be relevant to, theoretical physics today?
Could I have a few minutes to think about that?
Okay, sure.
You can ask some of our other participants to weigh in here. I need to think about that for a second.
I think what it's reminding me of is this, this space-time interval and special relativity that most folks out there who've read a lot about relativity may not appreciate, that there's this geometry, that's the space-time invariant, that's a pretty cool mathematical finding, and that does confirm a lot of what happens in special relativity. Most folks don't realize that geometry is built into space-time.
I was going to say that I think Plato's Cave is a good example of the sense in which some caution is required in making these kinds of claims, because like the observers in Plato's Cave, we are presumably quite limited in our ability to observe things, and we are observing sort of reflections on a wall rather than whatever is causing them. And one needs to be careful in distinguishing between properties that are sort of properties of the observations in virtue of the way in which we're situated and our own limitations versus properties that are properties of the world. And my concern is that with these discussions about it from bit, what's going on is that we're mistaking properties of our observations, like the existence of certain sorts of epistemic limitations or entropy bounds and so on. We're mistaking those things for properties of reality. We need to sort of keep in mind that the epistemic limitations that apply to our own observations aren't necessarily properties of whatever the observations are ultimately being caused by.
An original criticism of quantum mechanics.
Yes, that is one criticism, but I think it applies outside quantum mechanics as well. It's not limited to that particular domain.
You challenged me a few seconds ago, so I'm prepared now to respond.
Great.
So when I was part of a collaboration, 3 mathematicians, 3 physicists, and we came upon this very strange discovery. For a few years afterwards, I would get the question, what does this mean? And that's kind of what you just asked me. And it has led me personally to ask the strangest question in my career, which is, if the laws of physics involve error-correcting codes. And as soon as someone tells me they see a super partner in some laboratory, then I can make that assertion. If that occurs, the question is, how in the world did the laws of physics get to error correction? And to answer that question, the only way I know how to answer that is to look at nature herself as a model. And there's only one part of nature that I know where error correction is discussed. It's genetics. And in genetics, the proposition is the error-correcting codes are put there by the forces of evolution. And so the question translated to what I have seen is, what does it mean for evolution to act on the mathematical laws of the universe? I can state the question. I have no idea what the answer would be.
That's nice.
Thank you.
I am glad you thought about that. There is an old tradition, or there is a tradition, maybe it doesn't exist so much anymore, of thinking that the laws of nature might evolve. And, I mean, we were talking about Wheeler earlier, Wheeler thinking that the laws can be transcended. Ultimately, there aren't any laws, but there was an American philosopher named Charles Sanders Peirce who believed that the laws of nature could evolve, and that laws of nature were habits. I mean, there's like a lovely story of Peirce's explanation for gravity was that in the primordial universe, things were going around, and some things flew out, and some things sort of formed the habit of going around each other, and that was the origin of gravity. That it was a natural selection effect. So this group of philosophers, William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, John Dewey, they were known as American pragmatists, and they were perfectly willing to believe that the laws of nature could evolve. And there's a nice, I mean, I'm just telling historical things. There's the great mathematical physicist Henri Poincaré, his brother-in-law, Émile Boutroux, believed that the laws of nature could evolve. And Poincaré wrote a nice essay about what could it mean for the laws of nature to evolve. How would you have some kind of empirical evidence that the laws are evolving? And he said presciently, if you see that your theory gives rise to a singularity, then this must be a statement that the theory itself is telling you, I can't go forever. So I thought that was very nice.
But, I mean, you could ask yourself about the metaverse and say and some people do, they hear about it, they say that's a crazy idea. And then you, as a prominent philosopher, have written a whole book about it, which means to some degree you take it seriously. So why? Why isn't it a ridiculous idea? Why is it something to actually think about?
Well, the metaverse is not a ridiculous idea. The metaverse is actually something that people are trying to create right now in the tech corporations and elsewhere.
But we are.
But then there's the hypothesis. So I distinguish the metaverse, which is about the virtual worlds that we create, from, say, the simulation hypothesis, the hypothesis that we're living inside a metaverse or a simulation. And that's of course an old idea in science fiction. You get it in, you find it in The Matrix, but you also find versions of it. Plato's Cave is not too far from a version of it. René Descartes talking about the hypothesis that maybe all this could be a dream, all this could be produced by sensations produced by an evil demon. Yeah, the idea that all this is a computer simulation is a successor to that idea. Why take it seriously? Well, one reason to take it seriously is just the idea that there may be many metaverses, many simulations created in the history of the universe, maybe actually many more virtual universes than non-virtual universes, maybe even many more non-virtual people, many more virtual people than non-virtual people. I'm assuming, big assumption, assuming those virtual people are actually conscious and having conscious experiences like ours, then you say statistically, what are the odds that I'm one of the lucky ones at ground zero unsimulated. Nick Bostrom has actually given a statistical argument that we should take this hypothesis very seriously. I mean, and the fact that we're now actually creating these universes, I mean, we don't yet have simulated universes, anything like the depth and detail of the physical world, but no one would be surprised if in, say, a century we were getting pretty close to that. The fact that technology is going there gives us maybe all the more reason for us to take this seriously as a realistic possibility. So I don't advocate the idea. I don't come out and say, yes, we are definitely in a simulation, but I take it's a grand metaphysical speculation about our universe that we should take seriously. And interestingly, it's continuous with the it from bit idea. There's a level of digitality underneath our reality, but of course it goes way beyond it. Sometimes I talk about the it from bit from it idea. Yeah, there are bits underneath the its. The apples and particles are made of a level of bits, but underneath that level of bits, there may be so much more, such as, for example, the world in which the simulation takes place. So I think about the simulation hypothesis as a version of the it from it idea.
But earlier I spoke about the simulation hypothesis as exceeding the bounds of physics, at least as I understand it. And when I speak to the public in general, because I've been many times asked about this, I just point out to people that if you take the simulation hypothesis seriously, then ghosts are possible. Because if we're programs running on some underlying structure, when that program is terminated, as long as the underlying structure is not damaged, you can reinitiate that program. That's a ghost. And in my universe, I don't understand how ghosts can exist.
Are you guys making backups?
Yeah, I have concerns about the simulation hypothesis for the similar reason. At least within a sort of scientific context, I think there are certain kinds of hypotheses that we just have to prima facie rule out because they prevent us from using empirical evidence in the usual sort of way to confirm scientific theories. And I think that things like the simulation hypothesis, this as well as related things like the Everett interpretation, various things which significantly interfere with the relationship we presume ourselves to have with our evidence for our theories, just need to be ruled out at the beginning if we want to do any science. We should just, those things that they could be true, but we have to assume they're not true if we're going to do sensible science.
That's what I say. Some of us here are not scientists, we're philosophers.
Yeah,
It's a perfectly fine philosophical hypothesis without being subject to the standards of science.
Yes. So I'm happy with it as a philosophical hypothesis, but certainly within the point of view of trying to do science, these sorts of hypotheses need to be just put aside.
Well, it's funny because I think even in Descartes' case, people might argue that whereas he made a way out of this conundrum, could it be that the entire our experience is generated by a demon, etc. He made his way out by I think therefore I am, and then the God's perfect, and that's how I got out of that trap, right? But you could argue, and I accept this, that the implausibility of that first. Anyway, that's the way I take it.
Some people think
that really did a lot of the heavy lifting in moving away from that.
Some people think there could be evidence for versions of the simulation hypothesis. Maybe not for the perfect, indistinguishable simulation, but maybe say it's an imperfect simulation with glitches. Jim's colleague Zoe Devuti and others had a paper talking about what would it look like if we were in an approximate simulation that kind of cut some corners on the equations and found some potential evidence there, or if there are glitches like in the black cat that crosses your path. There's potential evidence for the imperfect simulation hypothesis, so that makes it at least maybe continuous with science. But once it becomes the perfect simulation that Descartes was talking about, one indistinguishable from physical reality, I guess at that point it becomes philosophy because there's no experiment you can do.
Well, from a scientific point of view, the problem is not so much that there never could possibly be any evidence, but more that there aren't really sort of meaningful steps that we can take to go out and seek evidence. We have to just wait for some glitches to show up, or for the people outside the matrix to decide to take us out and tell us the truth. Those would certainly count as evidence for that hypothesis were they to occur, but there's not much we can do to bring about those things happening as practicing scientists.
We can run our computers really hard and really fast to try and strain them to the max. See if we burn out those computers in the simulated universes, pull the whole thing to a halt. People have suggested serious research programs like that. Well, I don't know how serious.
I think more to the point that these kinds of hypotheses also have the consequence that looking back at empirical evidence to do things like try to confirm a theory like quantum mechanics is kind of pointless, because the simulation people can make our empirical evidence do whatever they like, and so there's no point in reading anything at all into one's empirical evidence if one believes that this is a viable possibility. So at least within that kind of domain, those possibilities need to be set aside, I think.
And my colleague, Dr. Chalmers, points out something that I've many times tried to convey to people, that if you believe in the perfect simulation, then the programmers in that simulation fit exactly the traditional definition of gods.
Right.
And so one gets outside of the realm of science very quickly if you believe in that perfect simulation.
I have a great illustration in my book Reality Plus of God creating the universe. And yeah, she's a teenage girl in the next universe up, working on her computer, and all the galaxies and nebulas come from there. So it may not be a traditional God. Could be a creator, could be all-powerful, could be all-knowing about our universe, but no particular reason to think they're benevolent or all good or all wise.
Well, I think a reasonable point back about the ghost idea that you cite, Jim, is that, well, whatever simulation, assuming we live in a simulation, of course, whatever one we live in, there's going to be some rules and regulations about the way, whether they're going to be standard ways we're accustomed to the world. And so, no, we don't have ghosts in our world. And whereas it would be possible, were it a computer program to have ghosts, in the world that these computer programmers, let's call it maybe, is the best of all possible worlds. I'll quote Leibniz, right? So they figured out, no, we're not going to have repeats in this world. So we don't, but that's one of the reasons we're not accustomed to it. We don't have rabbits that speak either.
Yes, but one of the things, all of us thought about quantum mechanics, and yes, it's stochastic and there's probability and what have you. But I have a hard time thinking about science where arbitrariness is totally arbitrary.
Yeah.
And again, in the perfect simulation hypothesis, that teenage girl might one day wake up and decide to change her mind and allow in 1,000 years for me to show up again. Yeah. Now, that might have some attraction to me personally, but I don't think that's how science... I see no evidence, let me put it this way, in my life that science is like that our universe works like that.
But I wonder if there's any pragmatic value in holding this, I think, silly belief, because it's not something you can invalidate. But it might be that it gives some comfort to the believers, just as one finds comfort in religion. Do you find comfort in the idea that you're some young lady's toy?
Like I said, I hope she's waking back up.
It's a very specific form of comfort.
maybe there's an afterlife here. I don't know. So I don't know. I think most people find this horrifying. The idea, at least initially, they think, "Oh my God, we're in the Matrix, the simulation. None of it's real. My life is an illusion." My own view is that's the wrong reaction. That it could turn out that we're in a simulation, and if so, life goes on. This is still real. I'm still having this conversation with you. We're still, I've still got relationships. I still have community. Those are the things that bring meaning to your life. So I'd say I don't find the hypothesis as horrifying as some people find it. I wouldn't say I find it especially comforting. It doesn't mean that we're all somehow at the mercy of this simulator as we are with a God. And I've got to hope that this simulator is benign.
Well, surely, if you were suddenly presented with good evidence that this were true, this would affect your decision-making processes in some ways. Like for me, it would significantly reduce my faith that the laws of nature are going to continue working in the way I expect. I would probably stop predicting things in quite the way I usually do, because, the simulator could change their mind at any time. Whereas, if I don't believe in a simulation, I tend to assume the laws of nature are going to continue to hold in roughly the same way.
Well, we could consider this system one from the point of view of doing philosophy, let's say. We could consider it a very pregnant form of like a thought experiment. Because we just talked about some other philosophers, Plato and Descartes, and it's a way to stimulate our thinking about, well, what do we think is the ultimate, what is existence like ultimately? Right?
And to me, that is in fact the value of a scientist discussing the nature of reality with philosophers. Because in particular, physics used to be natural philosophy before Newton came along and turned it into physics. So physics in particular bears a very, very close relationship with philosophy. And so I think of the simulation idea, although I find it sort of unacceptable in the framework of, as I understand the way our universe works and physics works, I find it as a tempting driver to make me think more deeply about that. And so I think that's the value, as a sort of hardcore scientist, that's the value that I see in this discussion, that it forces me to think more deeply and to try to find the errors in my thinking.
I think there's possibly a sort of intermediate hypothesis which I find a bit more scientific, where, rather than supposing that there's a higher consciousness creating a simulation, it's the idea that, maybe the underlying reality is kind of very different from the way we experience it, and our reality is in some sense a simulation running on some very different kind of hardware. And there have been various suggestions that, maybe the world has less dimensions than we think it does and that kind of thing. And in a sense, in that kind of picture, there is something about our experience which is sort of simulated or illusory. And I think that kind of possibility seems a bit more within the realm of science.
Maybe the simulation speculation, there are ways, I totally agree, there are ways that elements of this could be true without a full-scale simulation. You could dial it all the way back to the it from bit idea. Okay, well, maybe there's just a level of bits here generating our reality. Maybe there's something underneath the bits. Well, we don't know what that is. Maybe it's not a simulation, but maybe it's something else that's unknowable. Hey, some people have speculated that might be consciousness. Maybe the universe could be made of consciousness underneath the bits. I call that it from bit from consciousness. Even if you don't go that far, there are, the idea that, for example, space could be emergent from something more fundamental than space, underneath the space. This is an idea that's increasingly taken seriously in physical theories. And I think it kind of squares in quite interesting ways with the it from bit idea or the simulation idea, that the space we actually experience is somehow emergent. And I think, thinking about all these they start as initial metaphysical hypotheses, but some of them can end up turning into science.
We cycle around this. This comes up a lot, and it's come up in our other talks this weekend, where something like the term information, which seems to be two-faced. One is like, well, there's what there is, and there's what we know about what there is. Or that's a constant challenge for us. And I mentioned, the original struggles, and still for many people, ongoing struggles with how to interpret quantum mechanics. But the interest in information, also, my understanding of it is that it also arose after Stephen Hawking made the suggestion about how entropy might be related to black hole formation and its possible evaporation of black holes. And that fits into this holographic theory, I think, also. Am I right? I'm pretty sure.
That's connected, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering about that, going back to, well, what are the bits, and why do these keep coming up, and what to say about consciousness, and what to say about the universe?
I have been thinking about entropy bounds a lot recently in my recent research, and the question that I keep coming back to is precisely this question: are these entropy bounds a feature of reality itself, or are they a feature of our ability to get information about reality? Because what the entropy bounds are supposed to say essentially is that within some region of space-time, roughly speaking, the information contained in that region is proportional to the surface area rather than the volume. And a lot of people want to interpret that as a kind of an ontological statement about what's out there in the world. But if you think space-time is discretized, there's a sense in which it's natural, that's a natural kind of epistemic constraint, that we should only be able to get information out of a region in proportion to its surface area. So arguably that looks a bit like the kind of thing that's an epistemic restriction on our ability to learn things about the world rather than about what's really there. So it's an interesting question, I think, how we should distinguish between what features of our observations reflect what is really there and which features just reflect our sort of limited perspective on it.
Can I take that as an avenue to talk not just about information, but about mathematics in general? It's often comes across the statement that mathematics is the language of the universe, and that's something that I can't quite accept. And I've said in other venues that it's the only human language that allows us to comprehend the universe at a very intimate level, and it has several hundred years of proving that. But that doesn't mean that nature herself uses that language. So this emphasis on the distinction between what there is and our perception of what there is, this is a very important thing to keep in mind, I believe.
I think this is crucial when it comes to information, because this word gets used in so many different ways. I mean, there's information in the sense of something we know, some facts that we have, and then I call this semantic information. I mean, it's the original idea of information. I got some information. I know where the Helix Center is. It's on 82nd Street. Okay, that's information. That's something a person has or knows. Then there's information as bits, which is zeros or ones and so on. These mathematical entities, these things that might be out there in the universe, and that's not necessarily tied to anything anyone knows. That's just tied to what's out there. In my book, I call this structural information to distinguish from semantic information. It gets confusing because in contemporary databases, computer science, the web, these two things go together. People use zeros and ones, the bits, to code facts, things we know. But I think we've just really got to separate these things, and it's a shame that we've got the same word for these two incredibly important but totally different concepts. There's bits, there's facts, and these are really thoroughly different from each other.
Yeah, and also sometimes when people say information, what they mean is number of degrees of freedom or something like that, which again is not the same as bits or structure or semantic information necessarily. So it would be nice to distinguish those things better.
I count that as a kind of structural information. It needn't just be two. You have the bits, two ways. There's three ways. There's tricks. Maybe there's even continuous information for degrees of freedom.
I mean, degree of freedom, you could have many bits, but they could be required to be correlated in certain ways. So the number of effective degrees of freedom could be much smaller than the number of bits in your system.
I want to go back to this, Jim's notion about the self-correcting codes and whether or not it's a reflection. And of course, you didn't mean to suggest it is survival of the fittest, strictly speaking. Or anyway, it's not biological evolution. If it would be evolution, it would be some other sort of evolution. And of course, there have been a lot of mathematical models applied to how there are self-correcting features of the biological systems. And they usually do, once again, go back to theories about entropy and dissipation of energies, et cetera. I'm wondering whether that's a way to get a handle on, in some way, what would it imply if the universe goes through, I'm imagining a self-correcting change would be something moving away from what you'd think the way entropy normally would be functioning, right? I mean, towards a.
So my comments were within the very tight bounds of looking at this thing called supersymmetry, the mathematics of supersymmetry. That's what I've spent my entire adult life looking at, and in those confines, this idea about error correction, there's only one. I have an intuitive way which I would never submit as a scientific paper, and that is that it's my intuitive feel that if there was something like this kind of evolution that we're talking that would drive the presence of these error correcting codes into the mathematical laws, that it has something to do with exactly this point about the universe evolving. Because in genetics, right, the argument is that error-correcting codes are there because if you have two genomes, one with error-correcting codes and one without, the genome with the error-correcting code is more efficient at producing progeny because the one without produces progeny that don't survive. And so something like that, if you try to map that over to this picture, then you get the idea that that this kind of evolution that you brought up, Poincaré talking about the universe evolving, that it's maybe literally possible, and that would be perhaps why we could see this remnant of a set of error-correcting codes showing up in the laws of physics.
I found that a very attractive picture. Going back to this Peirce, Charles Peirce. That the universe kind of gets into a habit. It got into a habit of expanding. It got into a habit of having gravitational forces because perhaps, the genome has made this a good fit for things, at least for some amount of time. But of course, there's always random variations. Let's say there is higgledy-piggledy deeply in the universe. Things do change. And when things change, the law that aren't so well adapted to it disappear. That's kind of cute. Going back to this other thing that Jim said about that mathematics is the only language, it just reminded me of a philosopher I can never remember the name of, but I read about that philosopher in some essay by Richard Rorty. I can't remember Richard Rorty's name. And Rorty attributed to this philosopher the phrase or the slogan that the world is not sentence-shaped. So, you can write all you want about the world, but the world itself goes beyond anything that you can write about it.
I think it's Derrida, as he was. I think
Was it Derrida?
I think it was.
Okay.
It sounds like something he might say
gosh.
too, right?
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
I've been accused of being a continental philosopher by people like him. And I always try to shake it off.
Well, I think he tried to, whatever, provide some sort of background or substance, his way of looking at Derrida's work. Yeah.
It was Wittgenstein who said in the Tractatus, the world is everything that is the case. This was like the world is a world of facts, and to many people that suggested a linguistic picture.
But then he changed his mind.
He did, he totally changed his mind. It's not a popular view anymore, I think, that the world is sentence-shaped.
I was recently listening to a lecture by Mikhail Gromov, who was talking about evolution, and one of the million things he seems to have his fingers on. He's really incredible. And he said, evolution's actually very stupid. And, you just survive, you die, whatever. But a lot of the models we use in creating computer models we often think they're brilliant. They do incredible, brilliant things. And in some instances, they solve problems that we as biological entities can't solve. It's much faster, for example, et cetera. So one challenge to the idea that we're in a simulation is that things move along very slowly. They don't change suddenly with sharp angles and again, maybe that's because that's what we're used to. They change as fast or as slowly as we're accustomed to, and that's normal for us, right? But, all of us understood that if the laws of causality suddenly changed, or there was some other kind of, whatever, those sorts of changes would be possible for a simulation. I guess that's what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
Is that?
I think the simulators might just be setting up the simulation, like simulations one at a time, overnight, test out different laws. Maybe they're running a whole batch of like a million different simulations, just vary the parameters in the laws of physics and so on. And they just let each of them run out. They have to come back in the morning, check out the stats,
Which ones?
and then they'll update. That's how the laws of physics evolve, by the way. It's like, okay, well, these ones produce interesting results, so let's focus in on those. But yeah, no reason why they need to be paying so much attention to every individual simulation that like the laws are going to change.
But I mean, what grounds do we have for drawing any inferences about what methodology the simulators, if they exist, are adopting? We don't seem to have any sort of starting point to imagine what their purpose might be or what they're trying to achieve. So I don't necessarily see that we have good grounds in that scenario to suppose that they won't suddenly interfere, because we just have no possible understanding of what on earth they might be up to or what they're trying to do.
It's true. God moves in mysterious ways. So do the simulators. It's awfully hard to know their character. Maybe you can assume they're kind of like us, and then you'll get one.
I just don't see how we have any way to narrow down the space of possibilities if we allow that kind of possibility to start with.
Let's not assume they're like us.
What's that?
Let's not assume they're like us.
Right, well, and we couldn't do that either. We couldn't assume they're anything like us, or if they are,
just
whoever
kind
they are.
of refrain from
26-dimensional octopus.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Chris asked earlier is it possible people will find some sort of comfort in this? And I don't know the answer to that either. Maybe they do, maybe some people do, others don't. Maybe partially we all do. But we do know people find entertainment in it.
But I know at least one instance where I think some comfort, evidence of comfort was exhibited. So in 2008, as I said, I and a group of mathematicians and physicists found this very weird result. It took us 3 years to get the papers published, by the way, because we couldn't convince our colleagues that we had done our math correctly. But after a popular article appeared on this work in 2010 in the British journal Physics World, there was an online comment by a young man of deep religious faith, and he took comfort in this idea of simulation because it matched his conception of a benevolent God at work in the universe. So some people have taken comfort from it.
You know, there's a cute story about Einstein. It may be apocryphal, or it may not. You know, Einstein is known as the sort of arch determinist. That the universe is just happening, and that we as people don't play an active role in the universe. So a kind of fatalist. Anyway, the cute story is that if you trace his personal letters from the times when he was having affairs, on his wife, that he would take a very fatalistic stance in the personal letters, and then at times when he was on the straight and narrow, he would sort of not use that rhetoric so very much. So it looks like Einstein could find his own comfort in the idea of a fatalistic universe. Yeah, I had no choice. I had no choice but to have this affair.
I think there are these studies that when people read articles about there being no free will, they're a little more likely to cheat, I think.
Oh, no.
The devil made me do it.
Exactly. I was wondering when I would go back to the idea of information having this two-faced quality to it. I wonder, Kant wrote a lot about how we apply a certain intuition when we look at the universe and we see some things reflected back, like space-time and mathematical facts. I'm wondering, because I understand, David, you've written some more about the extended mind, which is another sort of iteration of that approach. Like, what can you logically derive from the fact that we are playing a role in how we see the universe? Do you want to say something about extended mind?
Well, the extended mind is partly the idea that the tools we use become parts of our mind. So this is something we've all gotten so familiar with smartphones. The smartphone, it stores phone numbers for me, taken over from my memory. It navigates for me. It does planning for me, and so on. And as we live these increasingly digital lives, so much of our minds is now extending out into these digital environments. In this new era, actually, of the Metaverse, where we're going to be, pretty soon we're going to be wearing augmented reality glasses. It'll recognize people for us. We'll have to remember everyone's names. It's going to be, that's going to be useful. And so much of the computing is going to take, so then the boundary between us and our environment is going to gradually become porous. And whether or not the physical universe is a universe of bits, our mind may come to at least some considerable extent a mind of bits, partly constituted by these computer processes in our environment. And then the mind in turn, of course, helps construct our sense of the world. And that was the big idea for Kant, that so much of our ideas about reality come from innate constraints on the way our mind is built to interpret the world. But the way our mind is interpreting the world is actually constantly changing and evolving as our brains change and evolve.
And let me just say, I really appreciate your making the distinction between a partial simulation, let me call it that way, and then the total simulation, because the partial one feels a little bit more comfortable to a physical scientist like myself, because I need to, as our colleague here said, I need to have the idea that I can falsify, right? This is the great definition, one of the great definitions of science is that it's about things that we can falsify, that we don't actually prove things correct. What we do is falsify our belief systems, and as long as you'll give me that partial simulation, I'm comfortable doing that. However, there's another aspect to the metaverse that you keep coming back to that I've been thinking about for a while, which is the universe, obviously, as we take these external instrumentalities and let them grow, then of course course, there's this thing that you know about called the Internet of Things out there.
Called the what?
The Internet of Things.
Internet of Things.
Right? The Internet of Things is out there. It's all these smart devices that are embedded in things. They have already become co-evolving because of us. Mm-hmm. One can imagine that they will somehow internalize an evolutionary development of their own that we no longer control. And of course, that's a frightening idea, perhaps. But when you start talking about things coming, our mind going into things, you have to also then, of course, ask a question about those things getting their own mind.
Not to mention all these AI systems, these language models that I think you guys were talking about here this morning, that are basically trained up on text produced by us all over the internet. So they start from a basis of us, and that they are internalizing elements of us, which they then project into into their own mode. As these language models are going to be increasingly systems we're interacting with, that Kantian building of the world that started with us extends to them, and who knows what directions.
And of course, there's already the AIs that do art. We've been following these recent discussions of AIs that produce art, and I have to tell you that there's this one particular incident that I think we've all read about human artists in a competition. It turns out a piece of AI won the competition. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many of you have actually looked at that image that was the winner. I actually love it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it elicits an emotional response from me, and I find that extraordinary.
So the simulation hypothesis and this issue of the AI are in a way opposites. In the simulation hypothesis, some other programmers are controlling or creating the world we are in. In the AI hypothesis is the computers and the programs we create are going to be controlling us.
Because these things, or maybe both at once, right? Maybe this is a simulation actually put together by AIs in the next universe, for whom it's absolutely trivial to generate a simulation of a universe like this, because they have so much processing power. But I think you're right; they're different. They tend to be different. Ideas. Of course, if we are actually creatures of a simulation, especially if we're in a pure simulation, there's a sense in which we are already AIs. We are ourselves simulated creatures, in which case we say, turns out being an AI is not so bad.
David, have you met my friend Mario? I don't know if you know him.
Oh yeah, Mario. His universe is the original metaverse,
He's
right?
a very agreeable, he's an agreeable guy. He'll do whatever you ask.
Yeah, he seems happy. Yeah.
He seems happy. Yeah, who?
Have you seen Free Guy? It's about a video game character who's basically a non-player character in a video game. All the humans come in. It's like, hey, we non-player characters, we deserve rights too. Like, this is real for us.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. The idea that we may evolve along with the development of these technologies is something I think it's already happened. Some of us don't realize it because it's something that's been in the background. We talked about this in one of our earlier roundtables, namely that our brains have not evolved apparently, or evolved enough to account for the incorporation of sort of reading and writing centers in the brain. Like the brains of earlier humans, before there was a writing system, were essentially the same brains. But now we seem to have these modules of, and maybe we should have had Ned Block about this too, right? There are the sort of modules rather in our brain that are devoted to writing, reading, and sometimes one and not the other. So there are cases where we've adapted to these technologies. It's a technology, right?
So the brain is kind of an all-purpose flour. It's waiting to be baked in any way that we might have.
Well, the world may not be sentence-shaped, but the brain is sentence-shaped.
Yeah.
some little bits of it are sentence-shaped, at least. They're adapted to deal with language.
Yeah. So what do you think about it?
Well, I have to confess, the tedium of discussing what the universe really is getting to me. Because I think we began with talking that what it might be, we have dubious access to our categories of understanding, our epistemic constraints, the autonomy with which the universe, or nature as you call it, unfolds. That puts us in a very difficult position as far as being able to make any kind of knowledge claim about it. And I think the technological fetishism that has infected this conversation pertaining to simulations have to be somehow technologically mediated. There are these simulation devices, while at the same time conceding that our brains are simulating things all the time by virtue of how we process information. And we should also consider that we may be in types of simulation that have nothing to do with technology, that have to do more with our myths, the way we kind of organize our understanding of one another, our acculturation. That also creates a bubble of reality, so to speak, a metaverse that isn't it from bit or technological, but very cultural, centered in the challenges of being ignorant, human, manipulated by power structures. Those simulations are also important to consider.
Yes, the mind's construction of reality is itself a kind of simulation. I mean, so much in the mind is constructed. It goes back to your point about Kant. I mean, in a way, it's not exactly the same idea. The world itself is a simulation based on a computer, but all of our experience of reality is actually it's an interaction between the mind and the world. And our minds these days are so bombarded with so many different things to try and construct things in a certain way. And technology is part of that. It's by no means the only part of that. So that's a quite different sense in which we could all be said to be living in a simulation. We're all living to some degree in a world which is constructed by our minds.
And our minds, talking about psychedelics, can feel and see things under the influence of them completely differently, so that the person feels totally different things about the world, themselves, reality, than without them. So there are layers of what actually our mind and our perceptions and our reality really is.
Well, I think drugs in general can do that. So can art, so can conversation. But speaking of hallucinogens specifically, they have, much like information, two faces. And there's the way that they can conjure up cathedrals in the mind of new visions, new experiences, and can be pleasing for a moment, can be potentially for some people entrapping, can lead to psychosis. But they can also move in a very different direction and dismantle the constraints of understanding, of information processing that allow us to organize the world to there's a notion in neuroscience of prediction coding, constantly throwing hypotheses out to the world. Our model of the world representing a best fit scenario, like an error correction, so to speak. But the errors aren't really with anything real. It's to just ensure a kind of coherent map. So they can dismantle that. And the map that we've constructed, for better or worse, is torn apart, and there's an experience of something else, maybe the other that is fed information, but there's a sense of something deeply unknowable, and that, speaking with David about this earlier, the ineffability that often is described in psychedelic experience has also been correlated with much of the improvement associated with them in clinical settings. This opportunity perhaps to relate to what is, but in a way that isn't discursive, that isn't information-based, that is more primordial and relational, can represent for people who are struggling with ossified modes of cognition, opportunity for making the way through the world in a manner that is perhaps less knowing, but at the same time freer, more aligned.
Can I respond to the last sentences? As I've been sitting here listening to this discussion, strikes me as a typical discussion of one of the two minds. Because at least as I've experienced life, there's kind of two versions of me. There's the rational version. It's the one that basically does the science and asks the questions about the world and navigates my living, continuing to live safely. But I'm also very conscious that there's this thing that used to be called the subconscious. And at least in my career as a scientist, I've actually seen these two things meet. And they meet on the axis of creativity and innovation. Because where do these new innovative ideas come from? And I point to, for example, the mathematician Ramanujan, who accomplished extraordinary things in number theory. And if you ask him where they came from, he would tell you they came from dreams. And that is not the purview of the conscious mind.
I was asking you a few moments ago about, does it give people comfort to think about this topic, the idea of the metaverse? And I said, I know at least it's entertaining, and it's interesting to consider, based on what you're saying, Elias, also some people start using drugs to change their consciousness for entertainment. I mean, we actually call them recreational drugs, right? So that's one of their possible uses. I really was interested in hearing what people thought about, what is it about thinking there's another level of being that we don't have direct access to? Why do people find that so appealing? I think that's a really important topic.
I think for me, as a physicist / philosopher or physicist, it's an important thing to remember because I think if one assumes that the link between what is observed and what is there is too direct, that is liable to lead into a whole lot of confusions and misunderstandings about what the physics is really telling us. And so I think that's something that as physicists and as scientists, one should not sort of lose sight of the fact that we don't see everything, we don't know everything, and we need to be careful to, as I say, to distinguish between sort of what facts are about our mode of access and what facts are about the world itself, and how to not sort of allow those two categories to get mixed up and cause mistakes.
I mean, we do live in I like this, on the importance of the unconscious. This kind of brings back that we do, in fact, live in a simulation quite regularly, every night. We dream and we enter into a simulation of our own making. And furthermore, a simulation which is not generated consciously, it's generated by our minds, but almost entirely unconsciously. And then we interact with that simulation, and it's very often extremely real and extremely meaningful to us. And that gets us at the power of minds, again, it gets at the mind's power to construct the world, but also the mind's power to actually construct a world unconsciously. And that's really an extraordinary creative power. And of course, it's doing that every moment in our ordinary waking life as well, in our perception of reality. It's just less obvious to us.
I like the idea of extending our thoughts to these, I called it earlier like a sort of a thought experiment, which may be one way of looking at the idea of there being a simulation going on, because of these mysteries. Like some folks like to spend a lot of time thinking about that, and what are the consequences of my thinking along these lines? Can I come up with something thoughtful, creative? Might it actually move physics forward? But even if it doesn't, it's a way for me to think about the world. So it's an act of creativity too, and occasionally something good comes of it. So we know that famous thought experiments through history. I mean, Einstein, I guess, was one of the first to really said, "I'm doing a thought experiment here. Watch out!" No, no, it's like, this is creative. Let me think about what it's like to sit on the light beam, right? that's a wonderful way for science to proceed, and it's not, what do you call normal science? That's the creative part of science. So I'm really pleased that some people are willing to go at it and go at it and go at it. I think it's wonderful for all the rest of us. So.
I think the question that's been haunting me is whether it is possible to know. So, we've been talking about the very illuminating findings in physics, for example, that get us, I think, closer to the nature of how things might be. But if we take very seriously Kant's recognition that what we perceive and understand are invariably molded by things that may have nothing to do with the nature of things, that it may be an entirely human endeavor, understanding, of which nature has really very little to say. What position are we in? Can we make any real claims about what the world is indeed?
I'm inclined to think we can't.
You can't.
I'm inclined to think that one can't.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm an American pragmatist. That's why I know so much about Peirce and James. And, that we do what works, or we try our best to do things. And I'm inclined to think that the laws of physics capture more about our limitations. And, so going back to the evolution, how can the laws of physics possibly evolve, you would ask? Well, one game you can play is to say, well, the laws of physics, in fact, are just an expression or codification of all my various limitations, or us as a species. We can't help but fall. We can get around that, though, with a parachute or, with a flying machine. We ultimately can get around some of these things. We can't get past, traveling faster than the speed of light. Well, maybe that's an expression of our present-day limitation. But we are evolving species, and our limitations may be different in the future, less limitations. So maybe the law of, the speed of light is a constant, is something that can be broken. If, you don't say, if you just take a different point of view, that the laws of physics are capturing how best to perceive the world, given what we've got right now. And that's not a knowledge claim. That's just a statement of more about us.
Mm-hmm. Practical reason.
I think that the comment you just made points to something that I try to keep in my mind and that I try to tell people about science. That when a scientist makes a claim about some kind of ultimate statement, you should take that with an extraordinarily large grain of salt. Because in many parts of human thinking, there's this notion of the truth. I like to tell people, when you're a scientist, you will change your belief in the truth at the drop of a fact. And so the word truth for scientists generally is not what most people call the truth. And therefore, I think that we need to be very, very humble when we make proclamations that we know. We know subject to our limitations. And that's why I come back to this.
I definitely have a lot of sympathy for the view that the laws of nature may have a lot more to do with our limitations than we realize. But at the same time, I'm skeptical that that can be the whole story, because the very notion of a limitation presupposes the existence of some kind of modal rigidity that there are things we can and can't do, and those remain sort of consistent over time. And it doesn't really make sense to me that there could be such limitations if there's not some kind of background schema of laws or reality from which those limitations arise. So although I do think it's very important to recognize that the exact form of the laws we come up with probably have a lot to do with our own epistemic limitations, I don't think that means we should suppose there is no reality or there are no sort of background laws at all. I just think we need to be perhaps a lot more careful than we currently tend to be to try to sort of tease apart the threads of our science which are about our limitations and the threads which are about whatever the sort of modal rigidity is from which those limitations arise.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a world. There's a world outside us, no question, and we can find out things about it. You know, the world. You know, you look at the world, you look away, you look back. It's still there. It fights back. The question is, you know, what can you know about it? It seems we at least know something about, say, if it's mathematics from science. We can know something about something of its structure, and so on. Can we actually know its ultimate nature? I don't know. I mean. You know, this kind of comes up in thinking about simulation and so on. There's underneath that mathematics, underneath those bits, there's so many different ways the world could be. It could be consciousness. It could be another universe. It could be pure information. It could be pure bits. I guess I'm actually inclined to think we occasionally get little glimpses of the ultimate nature of reality, not least through our own consciousness, and that maybe that's actually a glimpse of ultimate reality. And who's to say that there can't be, you know, special moments of awareness, whether through meditation or psychedelics and so on, to give you some clearer awareness of that ultimate nature of reality. I'm at least optimistic that it could be possible to know some tiny element of this, but you know, as what did they say in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Space is big, reality is big, it's bigger than us. We can't expect to know all of it.
Well, I think it's a sort of a mistake to want to answer the question, what is reality ultimately made out of? You know, I think that's not the kind of question science really gives us access to. But at the same time, I am optimistic that science does continue, you know, increasing our understanding of things, and there have been developments throughout the course of science that have, while not telling us what the world is made out of, at least giving us a better understanding of what that is structurally, and sort of removing from our way of thinking things that we thought were definite and absolute that we realised were not so. So I think that, you know, we can certainly learn things about ultimate reality without necessarily learning, you know, what it's made out of or what the sort of fundamental stuff is.
I'm still wrestling with something you said very casually, that there is a world outside of us. What do you mean? What do you mean by a world outside of us?
There's a world outside my consciousness, at least, that is producing my consciousness. But Berkeley's example of the tree and the clod, that, you know, you look around, you come back, oh, the tree is still there. The next day, it wasn't in my consciousness. Where was it? So there's something, you know, well, Berkeley's answer was God had the idea of the tree and the clod. The physics idea is that it's, you know, there's a bunch of matter out there. There's even the idea that it could just be another part of my mind, or a cosmic mind that I'm all part of, that's out there and it's responsible for my experiences of the tree. But at least there has to be something outside my consciousness to explain all these regularities, all these things that my consciousness discovers.
It's also, I think, about intersubjectivity as well, the fact that, you know, we presumably are all conscious and we're all having experiences, and we presume those experiences are related to each other in certain regular ways, and the world outside is whatever it is that gives rise to the set of related experiences and produces these relations between our experiences that are kind of systematizable and you know, relate us to each other in ways that we can make sense of.
I wanted to follow up on something Emily just said, and also what you said earlier, Jim, that when you're doing science, you get this idea of truth that's different from the one you might have come into with as a naive, you know, a non-scientist or just a young person, right? That things like, well, what really is there in the universe? And I think I think all of us probably agree, well, I don't know, that's sort of a woolly question, and we don't take that seriously, although we do look like we're earnestly pursuing it in some strange way. I think there's one of the interesting responses to your comment earlier, Elias, was that about the nature being something that we're applying models of understanding that are not in nature, they're part of us, but yes, they are in nature because we're part of nature, right? I mean, to a degree. You can say something about that. And maybe that's one way out of this, a partial way out of the conundrum. I think it's interesting that we do always want to pursue things like, well, what really is there? I think that's human nature to ask that question, and it may be a slightly childish question. I don't know. I mean, I think maybe it is, but it's still something that fascinates us all, and maybe why we're thinking about the metaverse. So we have to stop now because I think I imagine there are going to be some questions from the audience. And so if anyone has any, would they come up to the microphone?
So thank you very much for that fascinating panel. My question is about it from it and artificial general intelligence. You might be familiar with that concept. It's basically not narrow AI, but AI that will be a singularity and could be the metaverse. And then the point is that the it underneath is us. And you said before that the it underneath must be God, because he produces something without mistake. That means, are we God? And if we take that even further, the metaverse will come to happen. I'm curious about your reaction.
I missed the claim at the end. If we're God, then did you say the last time?
It is basically all the collective intelligence of all programmers.
Yeah.
And they produce the illusion that we are living in, because that's the artificial general intelligence, which is basically the metaverse. That's basically the singularity. That's basically the end station of AI.
So this is saying AGI, this is the view on which AGI has already happened, and the metaverse we're in was actually produced by an artificial general intelligence?
AGI is produced by us. So we are, the universe or the group of all programmers.
I mean, if the simulation hypothesis is correct, we are already artificial intelligences, and we're general intelligences, so we'd be AGIs already inside a simulation. But I guess the thought is that exactly the same could happen again once we create artificial general intelligences, which could happen within 10, 20, 30 years on current, given the pace of current developments. It will then be in a position to create the metaverse and a full-scale virtual world far better than we are. So AGI is a possible route to the creation of metaverses, of simulated universes, and so on.
And we will be God.
We will be God for those universes, absolutely, yeah. We have to use that power responsibly.
I'm not interested.
Don't want to be God?
Yes, come on.
Thanks for this panel. I'm always excited to go to a panel where the question begins with, is the universe whatever? It's always going to be fun. I had the benefit of being able to sort of check on a few things that were discussed during the panel, the first of which was Rorty. Rorty is, of course, famous for claiming that truth is sentence-shaped, and I looked it up. The idea that the world divides itself into sentence-shaped chunks that we call facts is Rorty's critique of analytical philosophy, which I think is interesting because it's an epistemological question. And as I was listening to this conversation, it seemed to me that meta has come to mean almost exclusively simulation or simulative. Whereas meta can actually be used in a couple of different ways. One is, of course, to say that it's a simulation. And I think this question immediately becomes tedious because even if it is, it's still the same universe, right? A simulation is always exactly equal to itself. So the way that which you would test, in which you would always, how many layers of simulations would it go back? It's an uninteresting question. But in terms of it not being so much ontological but epistemological, meta can also be used to be like the thing about the thing. So metacognition is thinking about thinking. Metalinguistics is language about language. And this brings me back to John Wheeler, who was very interested in the idea that the universe is observing itself. So is there a way in which the meta-universe or the metaverse is the universe that observes itself? And this, to me, takes us back to the hard question of consciousness, which is to say, is our consciousness of the universe already a metaverse? Because it's the universe observing itself.
I like that. I like that. And I don't know how to respond. I think I'm going to do Jim's strategy of think about it for 3 minutes, and then maybe I come,
And then have a brilliant answer.
I come back to that.
I like the idea that meta X is X about X. Metacognition is cognition about cognition. Meta theory is theory about a theory. By those lights, metaverse, I don't know, it's a verse about a verse. It's like
The verse is a crossing.
singing about singing.
Universe, the term universe is the one crossing. So the metaverse would be the thing that crosses itself. So we're back to the sort of self-reflexive.
It means to the side of, right? I mean, that's what that's the etymology of it.
Maybe it's short maybe it's short for meta universe. In which case it's like universe about a universe.
You know, another image that John Wheeler used. So, I mean, he's famous for having drawn
The U, yeah.
a U for the universe with an eyeball on it. There's a lovely little spot in his. He always carried a big notebook around and would take notes all the time. And in the margin, he sketches this, and he says, "I'll have to explain the story of how this came to me 2 days ago." And if you look in the notebooks, you can't find the story.
We'll never know.
of how it came to him. But there was another image that he used. He wondered whether the universe was a self-excited circuit. And I don't know if that has something to do with what you're talking about. But he was thinking of it as somehow being, coming back on it, an Ouroboros or something, for a long time in the self-excitation. I should think longer. 3 more minutes.
You only took 2 minutes, by the way, maybe.
I cannot possibly come up with a good answer to that query. But I think I would offer this as a thought. So I'm 71 years old. I've been studying a piece of mathematical physics since I was in my 20s. It's the same piece of mathematical physics that worries me now, that worried me in my late 20s. And I've thought about the universe this entire 40, 50 years of life. And to me, as we delve in these kinds of domains between philosophy and physics and recognizing the relationship between these two fields temporally, the oddest thing I know about the universe goes, apparently the evidence suggests it was started about 14 billion years ago in this thing we call the Big Bang. It had this period where it blew up from something much, much smaller than an atom to this thing we live in. It underwent transformations in space and time, stars turned on, galaxies formed. To me, the oddest thing about the universe is that in this entire time frame, it apparently only produces one copy of each of us. To me, this is extraordinarily mysterious. And so, in trying to answer the questions about the metaverse, what I am driven to is, in some sense, why do I, as an individual, come to be in whatever this structure is? To me, that's the deepest question that I know that I'll never have an answer to.
I think it's the idea that that's another way of saying what I was actually trying to bring up just at the very end, and we are a part of nature too. So in that sense, yes, we are looking back on nature with our natural selves. Any other questions?
There's a neuroscientist named Rodolfo Linas who talks about imagination as the physics of the mind. And I find that so beautiful because it's about trying to grasp reality but also know about all the probabilities. I'd be so upset if we really understood everything about the universe, because then what would we do with our imaginations? And I just wonder how you experience the difference between your speculations and just the play of imagination.
I'm willing to respond to that one, as opposed to the hard question that came over here. So one of the things that, again, when I talk to the public about how science works, starts with a statement that Einstein made. He said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Many people have heard this statement, but there's a sentence or two after that which, unless you read them, this statement can be mysterious. And it goes, because knowledge encompasses all that we now know about the world, but imagination encompasses all that we will ever know about the world. And so, for me, one of the great joys of being a scientist is to understand that my scientific knowledge grows, the rational part that we've talked about as physicists grows, but the driving force of that is imagination. At the boundaries where we don't know things, it's imagination that's driving the growth of that, but subject to the hard test of nature. That's how we grow in knowledge. So without the imagination, that process stops. And imagination is deeply, deeply non-rational. It comes from the parts of me that I prefer one piece of music to another, or another go. There's nothing rational about that. But that's what's driving my rational growth as a being understanding this universe.
Imagination may not only exist at the boundaries of comprehension, it may be implicated in comprehension itself and how we understand things, the theories we formulate, what we construct. But it's at play all the time. I see theory as kind of like fossilized imagination, as something that's kind of gotten stuck in.
There's an interplay there between imagination and rationality, because one imagines wild possibilities and then one applies rationality to them to ask, does this make sense? How can this all fit together? And one sort of pairs down the possibilities that one has imagined to arrive at something which is a sort of a viable theory. So the two components kind of come together to produce something that is original but also makes sense.
Until we imagine something else.
Imagination is both, as you say, more than what we know now about the world. I think maybe it's even more than we will ever know about the world, because imagination is not just about this world. Physics tells us about this world. Imagination tells us about the vast space of possible worlds that we can explore. And there's so much to know about that space of possible worlds that goes beyond this world. So even if today everything we've said is nonsense about this world, we've still described a possible world, a number of possible worlds, and maybe that's in its own way a source of insight.
A world in which we recur a million times, infinite times.
I want to pick up on what Dr. Gates said, that in Jacques Hadamard's book, where he interviewed scientists, Einstein also said every idea came to him as an image, not as a theory. And it was only his desire to relate and communicate that forced him to put it into theorems. I think that's so beautiful, because it's about what you've all been trying to do today in terms of trying to relate to us and tell us what you think you know and what you know you don't know. So I'm very grateful.
Well, that's great. Well, I think that's a wonderful point at which we can stop. I'd hoped that it would turn out the way it did, but this did exceed my imagination. It was a wonderful, wonderful. And I'm glad there's that little bit of extra surplus left over. So thank you again, everyone. I hope everyone here enjoyed themselves as well.
Thank you.